Hey guys, tonight we begin with the utterly reckless, occasionally poetic, and often puke-covered experience of getting wasted in medieval times, when alcohol wasn't just for fun. It was safer than the water, more reliable than a doctor, and significantly cheaper than a confession. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're a peasant in 13th century Europe. You've been working the fields since sunrise. You're caked in mud, your back hurts, and you're parched. But instead of reaching for a glass of water, you do something your modern descendants would find deeply alarming. You reach for a tankard of ale, and not because you're trying to get tipsy. No, it's because water could kill you. Medieval people had a healthy, well-earned paranoia of untreated water. Rivers and wells were convenient dumping grounds for sewage, dead animals, and the occasional unlucky traveller. Germ theory didn't exist yet, but people had figured out through trial and very unfortunate error that drinking straight from the stream was a shortcut to spending the night with your face in a ditch or in a shallow grave. The solution? Small beer, a low alcohol, mildly fermented drink made from grains, barley, and whatever yeast happened to be floating around. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't strong, but it was safer than the plague-ridden puddle outside. Children drank it, nuns drank it, even monks drank it. Though, to be fair, they probably had better stuff. The average medieval person consumed about a gallon of ale per day. That's right. A gallon. Not because they were all raging alcoholics though, let's be honest, some were, but because they genuinely didn't trust water. It was also cheaper and easier to produce than wine, especially in Northern Europe. In many places, ale wasn't just a drink. It was a food group, a calorie delivery system in a cup, liquid bread if you will, and far less chewable than the mouldy stuff the local miller passed off as food. And no, people weren't staggering around drunk all day. The alcohol content in small beer was usually 1 to 2%, just enough to kill bacteria, not enough to start a tavern brawl before breakfast. But if you drank too much, especially on an empty stomach, things got wobbly. While peasants were chugging low-grade ale to avoid dying from swamp water, monks were doing something a little more refined, inventing medieval craft beer. Yes, in between chanting, copying manuscripts, and regretting their celibacy, monks were quietly becoming the OG brewmasters of Europe. Far from being casual drinkers, they ran full-on brewing operations in their monasteries, and they were good at it, really good. Why monks? Well, monasteries were clean, relatively stable, and full of men with time, literacy, and access to big pots. Brewing became part of the monastic routine, just like praying, fasting, and passively aggressively judging each other's handwriting. They brewed for guests, for pilgrims, for charity, and of course, for themselves. Let's not pretend Brother Pius wasn't sneaking a pint between Vespers and Matins. They also perfected recipes. Unlike peasants who just tossed grains in a pot and hoped for the best, monks documented everything. They measured ingredients. They timed fermentation. They even introduced hops to the process. Yes, hops. The plant that gives beer its bitterness and lets you pretend your IPA addiction is sophisticated. And while regular folks were drinking small beer, monks brewed stronger stuff. Why? because they could. Also because during fasting periods solid food was banned, but beer wasn't. This brilliant theological loophole gave rise to what monks lovingly called liquid bread. It had calories, it had flavour, it had alcohol. What more does a cloistered man need? Some monasteries got so good at it that their beer became famous across regions. Townspeople would visit the abbey not for spiritual enlightenment, but for the booze. By the 14th century, many monasteries were running what we'd now call microbreweries, except instead of a guy named Chad in a flannel shirt, it was Brother Gregory with a toner and impeccable fermentation notes. Monastic beer became a brand. Even today, several beers still carry names tied to old monasteries, proving that holy men really understood the sacred relationship between man and mug. Before Instagram, before Facebook, and long before you could ruin your reputation with a tweet, there were taverns. And in medieval times, taverns were where everything happened. Weddings were planned there, deals were made there, fights broke out there. And yes, people got properly, gloriously, biblically drunk there. Taverns were the medieval answer to both the office and the town square. You went there to hear news, gossip about your neighbours, argue about taxes, and occasionally find out if someone had been secretly excommunicated. It was basically a medieval Reddit thread, except with more beer and slightly fewer trolls. Slightly. The interior was simple, with a dirt or straw-covered floor, rough wooden benches, an open hearth, and a tavern keeper who may or may not have cleaned the mugs this week. The air was thick with smoke, garlic, and regret, and on busy nights you might find travelling musicians, dice games, or an impromptu pig auction taking place between rounds. The drink menu was modest, usually ale, maybe cider, and if you were lucky or rich, a bit of wine. But no one came for the variety. They came for the chaos. And in a society where most people worked from dawn to dusk in backbreaking conditions, a tavern was more than a drinking hole. It was a pressure valve. It's also where social boundaries blurred temporarily. In the tavern, peasants could bump shoulders with merchants. Clergy might share a bench with the town blacksmith, and occasionally someone might start speaking Latin after 2 cups, and no one would stop them. Everyone was equal under ale until someone knocked over a jug. Then all hell broke loose. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Church leaders complained that taverns were dens of sin, and city councils tried regulating them with about as much success as regulating pigeons. But the truth was simple. Taverns were essential. They kept communities together, let steam blow off, and gave people a place to lose arguments, money, and memory, all in one night. In medieval Europe, how drunk you got and how much dignity you lost in the process often depended on your social class. Because getting wasted wasn't a one-size-fits-all experience. It came in tiers, like a really unstable wedding cake with a goat sleeping under it. Let's start at the bottom. The peasant. Your average village labourer drank small beer or weak cider throughout the day. Not to party, but to stay alive. It was a calorie source, a water substitute, and frankly, one of the few affordable pleasures in a life full of blisters and taxes. Peasants drank from wooden cups, clay jugs, or, if things got really desperate, their hands. Getting wasted wasn't always the goal, but on feast days you could count on someone waking up in a haystack with no memory and someone else's shoe. Now slide up the muddy social ladder to the nobility. Here alcohol was about status. Nobles drank wine, ideally imported, absurdly expensive, and served in a goblet that could double as a helmet. Wine was often sweetened, spiced, or perfumed. because nothing says power like drinking something that smells like your grandmother's closet. Feasts in noble courts were liquid marathons, multiple courses, endless refills, and toasts that went on so long you could grow a beard mid-sentence. Getting drunk at court was common, even expected, but it had to be done gracefully. Slurred Latin and wine-stained robes are forgivable. Throwing up on the bishop's lap slightly less so. Then there were the monks and clergy floating in their own bubble, technically celibate, occasionally sober. Monasteries brewed beer, but the priests drank wine for sacramental purposes, of course, which is a polite way of saying they were usually tipsy by vespers. But whether peasant or noble, the one universal rule was don't waste it. Alcohol was valuable. Every drop came from labour, fermented, stored and hauled by someone who'd rather be napping. You drank what you had and you respected it. Or you got in a fight with the baker and ended up in the stocks. Drinking was the medieval equaliser. It dulled misery for the poor and inflated egos for the rich. Everyone got something out of it. Some got hangovers, some got legends. So, you might be wondering, what exactly did medieval people drink when they wanted to unwind or just survive another day of ploughing, plague, or papal taxes? Let's begin with ale, the true backbone of the medieval beverage lineup. It was unfiltered, uncarbonated, and often thick enough to chew. Brewed from barley, oats, or whatever grain hadn't been stolen by rats that week. Ale came in multiple strengths. Small beer, light, regular ale, buzzworthy, and the kind that made you see angels or start reciting poetry. Sometimes both. Next was me, the drink of choice for those who wanted to feel a bit mythological. Made from fermented honey and water, it was sweet, strong, and popular at feasts, or among people who thought regular beer just wasn't theatrical enough. If Ale was the village plumber, I was the bard with the lute and questionable eye contact. Then came wine, mostly for the rich, the monks, and anyone living in southern Europe, where grapes were more plentiful than morels. But medieval wine was a far cry from your modern Merlot. It was often sour, weak and routinely mixed with herbs, spices or even seawater. Yes, cider. Nothing says I'm classy, like sipping a Cabernet that tastes like brine and regret. You also had cider and perry, fermented apple or pear drinks popular in orchard regions. Sweet, fizzy-ish, and dangerously easy to overdrink, especially if you were already 2 tankers deep into your no-work-today plan. And then things got weird. Some folks drank bracket, a medieval hybrid of beer and mead, usually strong enough to peel paint. Others enjoyed set, a bizarre hot mixture of curdled milk and ale. Picture a foamy soup made by someone who's angry at cows. Occasionally, medicinal concoctions came into play. Herb-infused wines that promised to cure everything from headaches to demons. Whether they actually cured anything is questionable, but after 3 cups, no one cared. And finally, there was ale mixed with raw egg for the brave and the soon-to-be nauseous. Did it help with strength? Maybe. Did it smell like something you'd regret? Absolutely. If you think medieval people drank a lot during regular days, you should see them at a feast. These weren't your grandma's polite dinners. They were all-night carnivals of consumption. Meat, music, merriment, and massive quantities of booze. And getting drunk wasn't just accepted, it was basically built into the seating arrangement. Feasts happened for any occasion. Weddings, holidays, the birth of a royal heir, the return of someone who hadn't died from crusading, or just because the Lord was bored and wanted to show off his new goblet shaped like a falcon. The drinking began early. Wine or strong ale was poured by the gallon, and guests were expected to participate enthusiastically. Refusing a toast could be seen as rude, suspicious, or even unpatriotic. In some courts, it was practically treason. Toasts weren't just cheers. They were elaborate rituals with speeches, blessings, and the occasional passive-aggressive poem. And every toast was followed by more food, more drink, and usually more bad decisions. Nobles drank from ornate cups of gold, silver, or sometimes carved horn, because even intoxication had to be a performance. Meanwhile, servants scurried around refilling mugs, clearing trenches, also known as edible plates made of stale bread, and quietly judging everyone. As the evening dragged on and inhibitions vanished, the party often devolved into a blur of singing, wrestling, and long-winded storytelling no one asked for. There are medieval records of people dueling over a better joke, or whose beard had more dignity. And then came the entertainers. Minstrels, dancers, jugglers, and that one guy who made inappropriate shadow puppets after too much me. All fueled by the same overflowing pitches. If things went well, you left wobbling, full of roast goose and good cheer. If they went poorly, you woke up under the table next to a jester and a broken lute, swearing you'd never drink again until next week. Feast was structured chaos and alcohol. It was the social glue and the accelerant. If you thought beer pong was the peak of human civilization, allow me to introduce you to the chaotic world of medieval drinking games, where the stakes were high, the rules were vague, and the chance of injury hovered somewhere around zero. Getting wasted wasn't just a side effect of medieval socializing, it was the main event. And games helped move things along. These weren't structured contests with scorecards. No, these were activities that started with laughter and ended with someone passed out in the turnip bin. One of the most common pastimes is toasting wars. 2 or more people would try to out-toast each other, not in clever words, but in sheer volume. It was less about poetry, and more about surviving round after round without slurring through the words to the king's goat. Another classic was casting the dice, often played for drinks, coins, or questionable favours. The dice were crude, often carved from bone, and the rules changed depending on who was sober enough to explain them. And if the game ended in an accusation of cheating, well, congratulations. You just invented medieval bar fighting, which we'll cover later. There was also who can drink the most the fastest. Not a creative name, but extremely popular. This was less about winning, and more about achieving bragging rights and possibly liver failure. Medieval men prided themselves on how many tankards they could down before falling into a hedge. In noble circles, drinking games were wrapped in rituals and manners, like courtly pledges. A lady might challenge a knight to drink a full goblet in her honour, a task he'd accept dramatically, possibly while composing a short epic poem and trying not to belch through the rhyming couplets. And of course there were games with physical consequences, balance contests, spinning challenges, and impromptu wrestling once someone mistook the minstrel for an ogre. The point was never really to win. The point was to drink more, laugh harder, and test the durability of the local furniture. In medieval Europe, drinking wasn't just socially acceptable, it was theologically endorsed. The church may have wagged its finger at taverns and bar fights, but when it came to wine, that was holy business. Let's start with the basics. Communion wine. At every mass, the priest would lift the chalice, say a few sacred words, and boom, it was now the literal blood of Christ, and then he drank it, often several times a week, sometimes daily. Now, it's not like priests were doing keg stands in the cathedral, but the ritual meant a steady, respectable intake of wine, all in the name of salvation. And wine wasn't reserved just for communion. Monasteries produced barrels of the stuff, technically for religious use, but somehow always with enough left over for, let's say, personal reflection. Monks documented their vintages, praised the divine quality of fermentation, and occasionally ended sermons a bit slurred. Then you had saints who were practically the patron protectors of partying. Saint Bridget of Ireland once prayed for a lake of beer for the heavenly host, and yes, that's a real quote. St. Arnold of Soissons is said to have saved thousands by urging people to drink beer instead of water during a plague. Science? No. Accidentally correct. Absolutely. Even religious festivals doubled as excuses to drink. Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days weren't just for praying. They were for feasting, singing, and warming your soul and bloodstream with ale or mead. Pilgrims often stopped at monasteries where monks offered hospitality in the form of bread, shelter, and just enough wine to make the next leg of the journey spiritually questionable. And if you passed out under the altar table, well, you were just resting in the presence of the Lord. Of course, the Church condemned excessive drinking, but like most medieval rules, enforcement was wildly inconsistent. A noble might get a stern sermon, a peasant might get tossed in the stocks. As a monk, he'd just get reassigned to less liquid duties. Let's be honest, in a world where beer was safer than water, someone was always bound to overdo it. And while medieval society loved a good feast and a bit of booze-fueled cheer, there was a limit. Once you crossed the line from merrily tipsy to shouting at goats and trying to joust a fence, that's when the town stocks came into play. Yes, the dreaded stocks, medieval society's favourite blend of punishment and public entertainment. These wooden contraptions clamped your ankles, wrists, or neck, and left you stuck in the village square, exposed to the elements, hecklers, and occasionally a very disappointed sheep. Getting put in the stocks for public drunkenness wasn't rare. If you were loud, rude, vomited somewhere sacred or strategic, or decided to moon a local bishop, you might find yourself clamped into public humiliation by dawn. The punishment wasn't just physical. It was deeply social. Your friends, neighbours, and that one nosy blacksmith's wife all got to watch you squirm, stew, and sober up slowly in full daylight. Children might throw old vegetables. Monks might mutter scripture at you. Someone would definitely say, "Seen that one before." Ironically, you weren't always punished for drinking, only for being bad at it. Nobles could drink themselves into a coma at feasts with no consequences. But if a cobbler tripped into a pig trough after 3 ales, suddenly it was a moral crisis. Authorities saw public drunkenness as dangerous, not because of the alcohol itself, but because it made people unpredictable. Slurred speech and stumbling were fine behind closed doors, but out in the streets that's how revolts start. Or worse, folk songs. Some towns even had ale tasters whose job was to make sure tavern beer wasn't too strong, or at least not stronger than the mayor's tolerance. Still, being drunk in public was rarely treated as a crime. It was a mild disgrace, a social slap on the wrist. You weren't a criminal, just someone who got a little too medieval on a Wednesday night. And after a few hours in the stocks, you walked away stiff, shamed, and probably planning your next visit to the tavern, just quieter this time. Hangovers in the Middle Ages were exactly as awful as you'd expect, minus the ibuprofen, and minus any sympathy from your neighbours. You wake up on a pile of straw, The church bells are going off like Judgment Day, and there's a goat staring at you because apparently you passed out in its stall again. So what did medieval people do for hangovers? Well, for starters, they powered through it. You had chores, you had obligations. You didn't have time to complain about your head splitting open like a rotting melon. You just muttered something about sin and staggered back into the daylight. But some people, bless them, did try actual cures. One popular one is raw eggs and ale, because nothing says recovery like mixing what wrecked you with what might give you salmonella. Others swore by vinegar or fennel tea or infused herbs, which usually tasted like grass and sadness. If you were lucky enough to have access to a doctor, and I use that term loosely, they'd talk about imbalanced humours and probably bleed you a little. Nothing helps a hangover like blood loss, right? Some just kept drinking. That's not a joke. Hair of the dog wasn't invented yesterday. Medieval folks figured, well, I already feel like death. Might as well top it off with a warm mug of redemption. The church, predictably, had a different take. Hangovers weren't just your body punishing you. They were God punishing you. The prescription was repentance and maybe fasting. Nothing cures a headache like guilt and a dry crust of bread. Honestly, most people probably didn't call it a hangover. They just called it Thursday. But make no mistake, getting wasted in medieval times had consequences. The difference is, you couldn't tweet about it. You just got up, wiped the ale crust off your face, and hoped nobody remembered what you did with that loot. At some point in history, someone invented alcohol. And about 5 minutes later, someone else got punched in the face with a mug. Welcome to the chaotic world of medieval bar fights, where your honour, your drink, and your questionable singing voice could all get you into trouble. Taverns were not quiet places. They were loud, smoky, smelly, and usually packed to the rafters with people who'd spent all day digging trenches, shoeing horses, or arguing with their landlord and were now 3 sheets to the wind over just about anything. Spilled drinks, unpaid debts, dice games gone wrong. Who had the better beard? Who insulted whose ox? And occasionally because someone thought the other guy looked too French. That was an actual insult in certain towns. Weapons weren't supposed to be brought into taverns. But let's be honest, this rule was as effective as modern no-smoking signs in 1990s bars. Daggers, clubs, and even walking sticks could turn into weapons if the argument got heated enough. And if you didn't have a weapon, no problem. Tankers were heavy, and so were wooden stools. Tavern brawls range from quick shoving matches to full-blown furniture-destroying chaos. Sometimes the tavern keeper stepped in. Sometimes they just watched from a distance, arms crossed, calculating how many tables they'd need to fix in the morning. Local authorities usually didn't care unless someone died or unless someone important got bruised. If it was just 2 peasants swinging wildly in the corner while a lute player kept strumming in denial, it was basically a Friday night. But if a noble or a visiting merchant got involved, suddenly the law showed up and stocks were prepared, or worse, you were fined a month's wages and banned from the tavern, which was basically medieval exile. Despite the risks, fighting was part of tavern culture. You went in for a drink and a laugh, sometimes you got both, sometimes you got a black eye and a story you weren't allowed to tell around your grandmother. Medieval drinking wasn't just a man's game. In fact, if you walked into a tavern or bought ale from the corner stall, there was a good chance a woman had brewed it, sold it, and maybe poured it on your head if you got mouthy. Enter the alewife, one of the most common and underappreciated figures in medieval booze culture. Alewives weren't just women who brewed beer. They were the primary brewers for centuries. Brewing was considered domestic work like baking or churning butter, except it could get you tipsy and occasionally cursed out by hungover blacksmiths. These women brewed small batches of ale at home, then sold it out of jugs, windows, or tiny stalls called tippling houses. Some operated out of their kitchens, others ran full-on public alehouses, and yes, they could get in trouble, especially if their ale was too strong, too weak, or mysteriously made people hallucinate and fight chickens. Alewives were expected to follow local brewing laws, which changed depending on the town, the year, or the mood of the inspector. Prices were fixed by law, which meant if an alewife overcharged or watered down her product, she could be fined, publicly shamed, or forced to wear a paper hat declaring her a bad brewer. Yes, really. Then there were tavern maids who worked inside the alehouses, pouring drinks, scrubbing tables, and trying not to get groped by guys named Oswald with 3 teeth and too much meat in their systems. These women had to be tough, fast, and fluent in insults. Some were just trying to earn a wage. Others flirted their way to better tips. A few married rich drunks and retired early, the medieval dream. But women weren't just behind the bar. They drank too, especially at festivals, weddings, or after dealing with 8 children and a cow that refused to cooperate. Drunkenness wasn't praised in women, but it wasn't unheard of either, and if the ale was good and the night was long, a few verses of body song were absolutely fair game. In the Middle Ages, if you were sick, injured, or just looked mildly uncomfortable, someone was going to hand you alcohol. Maybe it was a priest, maybe it was your barber surgeon, maybe it was your grandmother, but rest assured, the medieval solution to almost anything was to have a drink, and to be fair, it sometimes helped. Not because alcohol cured anything, but because when you're dizzy, feverish, or bleeding from a jousting mishap, a few cups of wine can take the edge off. Welcome to medieval medicine, where alcohol was a painkiller, antiseptic, sedative, and occasionally breakfast. Doctors, and again that term is doing a lot of heavy lifting, routinely prescribed wine and ale. If you had a cold, warm wine, a headache, wine with mint digestive issues, mead mixed with herbs served in what was essentially a hollowed-out medieval mug and a prayer. Even monks brewed herbal cures for healing purposes. These were strong, sweet, syrupy concoctions flavoured with wormwood, sage, or whatever looked vaguely medicinal in the garden. Today we'd call that digestive. Back then they called it medicine and just hoped you didn't die. One particularly bold remedy involved soaking herbs in brandy, then drinking it to cleanse the humours. Whether it cleansed anything other than your self-respect is debatable, but you did stop complaining, either from numbness or unconsciousness. In battlefield medicine, alcohol had a real purpose. It cleaned wounds, or more accurately, it stung like hell and distracted you from the guy sawing off your leg with something that used to be a farming tool. Sometimes they gave the patient a strong drink before the amputation. Sometimes they were the patient and just passed around the bottle. But medieval people didn't just use alcohol for injuries. It was prescribed for melancholy, plague symptoms, childbirth recovery, and spiritual despair. If you were breathing, there was probably a bottle involved. Did it work? Occasionally. Did it make things worse? Also occasionally. But hey, in an age where bloodletting was considered science and leeches were practically co-workers, alcohol was at least pleasantly wrong. If there's one thing governments have always been good at, it's noticing when people are having fun and figuring out how to tax it. And in medieval Europe, alcohol was no exception. Drinking wasn't just a pastime, it was an economic engine. Brewing, selling and serving alcohol created jobs, generated revenue, and gave local authorities yet another excuse to write unnecessarily dramatic laws. Some towns even had aliconers, official taste testers, who checked whether the beer was good, legal and appropriately frothy. Not a bad gig, assuming you didn't mind gout. Taverns needed licenses to operate, though what counted as a license varied wildly. In some places it was a stamped document. In others it was just a verbal agreement with the local chief and a sack of onions as collateral. But if you served ale without permission, you could be fined, shamed or shut down faster than a poorly played lute solo. Prices were also regulated. That's right, price caps on beer. Authorities posted ale prices on wooden boards, and alewives or tavern keepers who charged too much were punished in theory. In practice, if your ale was strong and your cousin worked at the mayor's office, things got flexible. And then came the taxes. taxes, wine taxes, malt taxes. In some places there were even drinking vessel taxes. Imagine getting fined for using a cup that was too fancy. Welcome to medieval capitalism. Monasteries and nobles often had tax exemptions, of course, because nothing says divinely inspired like not paying duties on your barrels of mead. Meanwhile, peasants were stuck paying levies on every batch they brewed for family gatherings, even if it tasted like watery sadness. But these regulations didn't stop people from drinking, they just made them more creative. Some taverns operated unofficially, some brewers sold off the record, and others simply bribed the right people and hoped no one checked the ledgers too closely. The result was a booming, slightly illegal, ale-soaked economy built on loopholes, gossip, and the unshakable human desire to have a pint at the end of a long day. In short, medieval booze wasn't just social, it was business, and business was booming. By the end of the medieval period, the way people drank and what they drank started to shift slowly and subtly, and with far fewer pigs in taverns. One major change came with the rise of stronger alcohol. Distillation, that magical process that turns wine into something that could clean wounds and erase memories, became more refined in the late Middle Ages. This gave birth to early versions of brandy, aquavit, water of life, and other dangerously potent drinks that made beer look like toddler juice. At the same time, international trade expanded. Exotic spices, new brewing techniques, and eventually sugar and rum made their way into Europe. With every shipload of imported goods, drinking culture evolved. Ale began to lose ground to wine and spirits, especially among the wealthy, who now wanted to sip imported claret and pretend they were part of the Renaissance. Taverns also got an upgrade. By the 16th century, some evolved into inns and public houses, early versions of the pub. Drinking was no longer just something you did after work. It became a structured part of travel, politics, and even postal delivery. Yes, medieval mailmen drank frequently, and then came the Reformation, which poured cold water and guilt on a lot of the party. Reformers like Calvin and Knox were not big fans of public drunkenness. Suddenly drinking became a moral battleground, and taverns were accused of being dens of sin, sloth, and questionable fiddle-playing. Governments got stricter, licensing laws multiplied, taxes increased, public drunkenness was increasingly criminalised, but the desire for a good drink never went away. It just adapted. Allowatives were pushed out by guilds and mal-run breweries. Wine was regulated by state-appointed officials. Spirits became fashionable in court, and slowly but surely drinking moved from an everyday necessity to more of a social choice. The Middle Ages gave way to modernity, and while we gained better sanitation, cleaner water, and slightly less me, we also started to forget how deeply entwined alcohol had been with survival, celebration, and social life for centuries. In ancient Babylon, love was not a spontaneous rosy-cheeked affair. It was war, and like any good war, it required strategy, incantations, and sometimes the assistance of a very grumpy demon. Babylonian love magic didn't shy away from meddling with the supernatural. If you couldn't win someone's affection through charm, you'd write their name on a cursed clay figurine and bury it near their door. Just like that, you had leverage. Who needs roses when you've got necromancy? The Babylonians believed love could be summoned or subdued through ritual and invocation. Tablets from Mesopotamian archives describe enchantments where a priest or sorceress would call upon Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, to bend the will of a target. And Ishtar was not the gentle harp-playing type. She once destroyed an entire mountain range because someone dumped her. So, yes, she knew a thing or two about vengeance and passion. Some spells included hair, nail clippings, or drops of blood, organic tokens to tether the lover's soul to the spellcaster. These were either burned in small fires, dissolved into oils, or wrapped inside fabric pouches. These pouches would be buried beneath thresholds or hidden in beds to heat the heart of the desired person. The heating could sometimes cause obsession or madness. But hey, what's love without a little side effect? And it wasn't all about attraction. Babylonian texts also mention apotropaic spells designed to drive away unwanted suitors or remove a rival's erotic pull. In one particularly nasty charm, a woman asked the gods to make her rival's breath smell like a corpse. Subtle, effective, and guaranteed to ruin any moonlit moment. This mix of erotic desire and divine manipulation created a culture where love was a battlefield layered in ash, honey, blood, and whispers. You didn't just hope someone loved you. You dragged them into a cosmic tug-of-war using scrolls, dolls, and invisible spirits to tip the scale. Love in Babylon was rarely mutual. It was an act of will. And when words failed, spells stepped in, etched in uniform, whispered to the stars, and sealed with sacred smoke. Babylonian love wasn't pure, but it was potent. In ancient Greece, love spells were less about hearts and flowers, and more about domination and desperation. The Greeks had a specific name for this magical obsession, eros. But it wasn't the gentle affection you'd write poetry about. It was a frenzied, all-consuming madness, more likely to land someone in a temple begging for mercy than walking hand in hand through olive groves. Greek love magic was split into two powerful branches, Agoge spells and Philia spells. Agoge spells were meant to drag someone, sometimes literally, to the practitioner. Usually used by men, these spells aim to inflame lust, cause sleeplessness, and even make the victim hallucinate until they surrendered to desire. A typical rogue spell might say something like, "Burn her heart until she comes to me crawling." Yes, crawling. Greeks were not subtle about their intentions. The spells were often written on lead tablets, cheap, durable, and heavy with symbolism, and buried in graveyards or wells, places considered gateways to the underworld. Why? Because these spells often invoked underworld spirits or restless ghosts to do the dirty work. If you wanted someone to fall in love, you'd call on a dead guy who had nothing better to do. On the other hand, Philia spells were more about affection management. These were often used by women trying to maintain peace in marriages or control their husbands' wandering eyes. Rather than summon burning passion, philia spells focused on harmony and loyalty. They were sometimes infused into wine or oil, acting like magical tranquilizers hidden in daily rituals. Of course, herbs and potions played their part. Greeks used aphrodisiacs like mandrake root, which looked vaguely human and was believed to scream when uprooted. Probably not ideal first date material. Love potions also included honey, myrrh, and even crushed bones mixed into drinks or rubbed onto clothes. A particularly strong recipe involved menstrual blood, an intimate and powerful ingredient believed to tie a man's soul to his lovers forever. Greek erotic magic wasn't romantic in the modern sense. It was strategic, visceral, and usually aimed at control rather than consent. Os, the god of love, was often depicted blindfolded and armed with arrows for a reason. Love wasn't just blind, it was dangerous, and the Greeks knew exactly how to weaponize it. When it came to love, the ancient Romans took what the Greeks started and added more wine, more drama, and far more legal loopholes. Roman love spells weren't merely folk traditions whispered by lonely hearts. They were considered tools of influence, status preservation, and occasionally straight-up revenge. In a society obsessed with order and honour, controlling another person's desires became a stealthy way of rewriting fate itself. Roman love magic came in many forms, but defiction, or binding spells, was among the most popular. These were usually etched into thin sheets of lead and folded like cursed love letters before being buried in tombs or tossed into rivers. The idea is to entrap the target's mind, body and spirit by invoking chthonic deities like Pluto or Hecate. The writing was often sharp, commanding and full of desperate pleas. Some read like court summons, others resembled melodramatic fan fiction. A particularly eerie example from Rome asks that a woman named Victrix burn with love for me, Marcus, like a torch day and night until she can no longer bear to be without me. Sounds romantic until you realise Marcus buried that spell next to a child's grave to add extra power. Roman ethics, optional perfumes and oils were another avenue for magical manipulation. Women would anoint themselves or their intended lovers with concoctions laced with herbs like vervain, mint, or even belladonna, which could sedate or stimulate depending on the dosage. A sweet-smelling woman might not just be trying to impress. She could have been dosing her towering crush with a micro-love spell in liquid form. One particularly scandalous Roman tactic was the so-called Venus wine, a potent love potion allegedly containing animal parts, exotic herbs, and bodily fluids. Slaves and courtesans were rumoured to slip it into their masters' goblets to tilt the power balance. If the potion didn't work, at least the hangover might spark some vulnerability. Roman law, interestingly, did acknowledge love magic, but not as a crime of passion. Instead, it was lumped into sorcery and considered a public threat if it disrupted property rights or inheritance. Love was all fun and games until someone cursed a senator into celibacy. For the Romans, love was political, magical, and occasionally toxic, just the way they liked it. In ancient Egypt, love was sacred, mystical, and dangerous in the hands of the wrong priest. Egyptian love spells combined religious devotion, poetic metaphor, and, when needed, ruthless manipulation. These weren't the ramblings of a heartbroken teen. They were carefully composed rites, often recorded on papyrus and backed by the authority of deities like Hathor, Isis, and Bez. If your heart was broken in Egypt, you didn't cry. You conjured. Egyptians believed love could be stirred like a potion or unlocked like a tomb, and their magic reflected this. A common technique was the dream spell, in which the spellcaster summoned a god or demon to appear in the dream of the desired person. The spell would whisper, "You long for her like the desert longs for rain." Elegant. Yes. Manipulative. Absolutely. One recovered papyrus from the Ptolemaic period describes a spell where the target's heart is likened to a captive bird fluttering endlessly, unless reunited with the one who cast the charm. These texts were often written in red ink, considered magically potent, and sometimes included miniature drawings of bound figures or symbolic birds with clipped wings. A visual cue just in case the gods needed reminding.